We're very excited to be here, or however virtually it may be. I just wanted to lead off with some brief introductions to about us and our organization and sort of what we can do for you. We are a 38-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit based in DC. Our major area of focus is on money and politics at the federal level. We're largely a data-focused organization. So that's kind of our main wheelhouse, is dealing with typically publicly available government data resources. We're nonpartisan, sort of devoutly so, and have been sort of in the business of running our website, Open Secrets, since the late 90s. In the last, I'd say 15 years, we've really expanded our data resources from simply campaign finance donations, sort of when somebody gives to a member of Congress. That used to be what we focused on. Now we include information about lobbying activities, information about the personal financial disclosures for members of Congress, and how they hold their wealth, race and gender data for political candidates across the board, political advertisements from Facebook and Google, and sort of wherever the money leads, we try to follow it and get it into the hands of people who can use it to make change or inform their reporting. We're typically cited by thousands of media outlets every year, which is great, but we'd always like to be cited by thousands more. I think, as far as my relationship to our products are concerned, I oversee our data processing and our sort of research department. And that includes collecting the data from, in most cases, the Federal Election Commission, which we'll talk about a little bit, but also the other data resources that we access, and then really trying to compile it in a way that's timely and accurate and meaningful. So Brendan's going to kind of lead off with some of our information about political candidates, and then I'm going to pivot over to the ever fascinating topic of super PACs and outside spending. I think we like to keep it kind of casual. So if you have questions, please feel free to kind of raise your hand or use the chat function, especially if you have a clarification. A lot of the language in this space can be really unnecessarily technical. And so if we're talking about PACs and, that's probably the most common acronym, and you probably know what a PAC is. But if we're talking about something and it makes no sense, just feel free to shoot us a chat. So, Brendan.
Yeah, I'm going to start sharing my screen in just a moment. But as Sarah said, I'm going to walk you through all the different types of information that you can get on a given candidate who you might be writing about. And you can see all the different subcategories of campaign finance that there are available. All right, so you can see right here, we're on our homepage. We have a bit of our own in-house journalism here, if you want to take a chance to peruse that at some point. But we'll go to the menu tab here. And when you're writing about congressional candidates and members of Congress, these two buttons are going to really be the places you want to go. Congress, where we have profiles of every member of the House and Senate. And then congressional elections, where we're tracking in progress races. And you can go back and get historical information on historical elections as well. But we're going to go to Congress, right? And if or is a member of leadership, they're going to be right on this front page. Offer up a member of Congress as an example, just so we can get a tour of their profile, so you get an idea of what you can get on all members of Congress. All right, well, she's right here, so let's just use Speaker Pelosi. We can see here on her top contributor down a little as we go deeper. Is everybody able to?
We can see you, Brendan, but you're really breaking up a lot.
Oh no, maybe it's because I'm going back and forth to pages that have a lot of graphs on them.
You sound fine now. I'll
Okay.
chat you with it.
All right. And you're able to see my screen? Great. So we can see the Finance Committee, and we can choose whether or not we want to look at a specific election cycle or go back through her entire career. But let's just take a look. This is going to be an overview right now of the 2019-2020 cycle. So as she's the leader of her party, she gets quite a bit more money than the average member of Congress. We can see the amount raised and the amount spent. And then top contributors and top industry listing individual contributors. We group them based on the itemized data that we get from campaigns and from fundraising conduits, etc. So we can see that her total top giving from the University of California, and most of that money is coming from individuals who listed the University of California as their occupation when they were contributing. But we can also see that some of this money is coming from PACs as well. Her number 5 contributor, Alphabet Inc., of the 39,000 that she got, 10,000 of that was coming from corporate PACs affiliated with Alphabet. And then to kind of zoom a little bit further back, we're looking at industries as well. So not just the employer of the individuals who are giving money, but a broader idea of the industry, so you can get an idea of what interests are behind a given candidate. So retirees are going to be in the top 5 of most members of Congress, simply because there are so many of them and they represent such a wide swath of interests. But then as we get a little bit further down, you can see some other industries that are supporting her. Does anybody have any questions? Great. And then we can see the total that she raised versus the average member of Congress. 2020 was a big year for her, as it was for a lot of people. And then at the bottom here, you can see a breakdown of how much she raises from small individual contributions versus large individual contributions, PAC contributions, etc. So this page is really designed just to give you a basic overview of her fundraising for that given cycle, or if you wanted to look at her career, her entire career. Now we have these individual tabs going forward. I'm going to try not to jump too much, especially since you guys.
Question.
Sure, ask it.
So, to be clear, the contributions from UC, from the University of California, they're not from the university itself. It's from people with affiliations. Like it could be professors.
Yes, it could be anyone who gets their primary income from the University of California. So it could be a professor, it could be a janitor, anyone who would be getting their primary income from the University of California. It could also be the non-working spouse of a professor or someone who works at the University of California.
And when they give that contribution, they have to declare that affiliation?
Yes, when they make a contribution, they are required to disclose their name, their zip code, and their occupation. And then if a contribution is over $200, it is required to what is called itemized by the campaign, where they have to disclose that information to the FEC. And then some campaigns can choose to disclose amounts lower than $200, or if they gave to Nancy Pelosi through Act Blue, or if she was a Republican, Win Red, those online fundraising conduits are required to disclose all of the information that is passed through them. Now, I know I just said a lot of terms that we might not be familiar with, so does anybody need a follow-up there?
I'll just follow up to clarify too that that's federal law. It's also law in most states that people have to disclose their employer when filing a sorry, not people, the candidates have to disclose the employer of the donor. That is born of the Watergate scandal and trying to make sure that you don't have politicians beholden to corporate interests, however you might define that. Now, University of California is probably not a great example. And we get criticism for our method of displaying contributors for that reason. But in many cases, you won't see University of California as the top donor. You'll see Enron or Exxon or something. And so it can kind of give you a better sense of who the interests are who are supporting that politician. Over time, more politicians have started relying much more heavily on what we call small donors, people giving less than $200. And so you start to see kind of what looks like a more democratic pool of donors. Yeah, so that's
so, but if they give $50, then they don't have to disclose their name and their affiliation?
They don't, but Act Blue, if they're donating through Act Blue, which is a conduit committee that funnels most donations to Democrats. If you go online and you donate to Joe Biden, for example, you're actually donating to Act Blue, and they're donating to Joe Biden. Act Blue is required to collect that information. Okay. So typically a small donor would not have to do that. But since so many Democrats use Act Blue as their online fundraising platform now, we know a lot more about the small donors than we ever used to.
And then I saw someone else had raised their hand.
Yes, had a quick question just to follow up on that University of California. Would there be any way of distinguishing whether that's the University of California system or just Berkeley or anything like that? Because I mean, these states like Florida, I mean, they have like the same kind of thing, but you're not necessarily sure if they're working for the school or the system underneath it. So I'm just curious about that.
I'll answer that since I deal with it. Yes, but not necessarily on the website. If you want to dig in to a specific university system, for example, or a company or union, or a company that has a lot of sub-arms or subsidiaries or local branches, we tend to group up. And that's for clarity. But I can understand why you might be interested in UC Regents versus UCLA Hospital versus Berkeley. And in those cases, they might get lumped into the University of California, but we can oftentimes parse that out a little bit for you. I will say that donors themselves and candidates are not always great at providing detailed information about where people are working. So it's never totally perfect, but we try.
Yeah, people are trying to minimize the amount of information they necessarily give.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
And individual donors can vary in what they put down, even from the same donor giving multiple times in a given election cycle. They can vary what they put down as their occupation. Mm-hmm. Moving on. You can take a look at all of Nancy Pelosi's past elections. Now, if you're at the beginning, if we'd gone to race, all of the races were going on, but this is going to be a brief overview of all of the elections that Nancy Pelosi has won, at least going back to the year 2000. And you can see a breakdown here of the amount she spent versus her top opponents. So if you're trying to get a history back of a given candidate, this might be something that would be helpful to you. And then if you wanted to click on any of these, I'm not going to, so my audio doesn't get disrupted. You could see a further breakdown of each individual race. And we're going to have going back to the 2000 election cycle. So if you wanted to see, especially if someone is a perennial candidate and they're running cycle after cycle, you could get a historical look at their previous races, especially if the same person has tried to unseat Nancy Pelosi multiple times. Now, I'll let you guys kind of explore. Actually, I can jump to this one because I have the tab open. To the industries tab. And again, this gives you just a broader pullback the types of industries that are going to be supporting an individual. And Nancy Pelosi might not be the best example of this because as the leader of her party, she's going to be getting a lot more than average members of Congress. But you can see that candidates of different sectors, agricultural services, business services, Democratic liberal, nurses, etc. And then the number two of a number of industries as well. had the top 20. You just a ball of what was on the main page. And a breakdown again between individual giving and PAC giving. Now, I don't want to disrupt the feed too much anymore, but you can see that these tabs would have a further break giving here as opposed to the individuals and a deep dive for contributors. One of my favorite tabs is the geography tab, where you can see a breakdown, like we said, not only do people disclose their occupations, but they're disclosing their zip code as well. And getting a dive into that area gives you an idea. We just published a story today about how a number of incumbent Democrats who are running for re-election in 2022 are amassing these huge sums of funds. And a lot of this is because of conduits like Act Blue and Win Red that allow them to reach broader audiences and allow people from farther across the country to give them money. We use this tool to write this story about these incumbent Democrats getting 3/4 or more of their funds from donors from outside of their states. And again, Act Blue and Win Red being these groups that fundraise online and disclose everything, including those contributions that are under $200, gives us greater insight into donors who are giving smaller amounts and who those people are and where they live. And as Sarah said at the beginning, we also do research related to gender and race in elections. Race does a good breakdown of the gender of donors that are giving to particular candidates. And then we can also see breakdowns of expenditures as well into, I'm going to try to break up too much as I click on this.
Can I mention something? That point about geography, that was something I heard about.
Yes.
During the Georgia senatorial election for because it seemed like a lot of money that was coming into Georgia was coming from different regions of the country. You could presume for whatever reason, but that was kind of interesting that a lot of news commentators I saw were mentioning that a lot.
That's become very common for Senate races. And I like to look at, when I'm kind of doing punditry, I look at whether a candidate's getting a lot of money from small donors, but then also how much of their money is actually coming from their district. And one sort of canary in the coal mine oftentimes is, if you could look at like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's first race, she outraised her opponent during that race from small donors, and a lot of it was in district. That's a bad sign if you're an incumbent, if you're getting outraised in small donors, because those are actually closer to voters. Most of the people in our data are CEOs, VPs, political activists who might not actually know anything about your race. They're just kind of trying to support the party line. And so that's why we see all of these races in, think of Maine, Kentucky, South Carolina, where many of the Senate candidates had big national profiles but weren't able to connect as well with, or were actively prevented from connecting in some cases with their local communities and local voters. So, I think that sometimes money can tell a complicated story, but your point about geography and Georgia is an excellent one, because that was kind of actually sort of a strange exception, because both the Democrats who got a ton of their money from out of state won, but they were squeakers. So I think that it's not necessarily always a perfect correlation.
But it is always something interesting to note. So looking back to the screen here, we can see a breakdown of her expenditures, because it's important to note not only where the money is coming from, but where the money is going, and see a breakdown of the top vendors and recipients of her campaign spending as well. And then we're finishing up this look at Nancy Pelosi's page, the legislation that members of Congress are introducing as well, because oftentimes there might interesting relation between the legislation that they're introducing and the industries that they're getting a lot of campaign money from. So just to quickly go back, not to disrupt the feed again, but I want to take you to this congressional elections page, because this is where elections that are ongoing are going to pop up. And if you're tracking a race like those top tier Senate races, where one of the candidates probably isn't holding federal office, this is going to be the best place to be tracking those funds. So let's look at the Georgia race. You could either select it by state or by candidate. I'm just going to search for Senator Warnock's name. All right, so we can see here now breakdown of all of the candidates who were running in that 2020 race. So rather than looking at from the angle of a specific candidate, we're now looking at the overall race. So if you remember, there were running in the primary quite a wide range of candidates that were running, but obviously the two that advanced to the runoff, Kelly Loeffler and Raphael Warnock, are the ones that have the most money because they were lasting the longest and got to that point where money was flowing into the race from all over the country. So I will hand over to Sarah in a bit, but just want to look at the geography tab here, because as you can see, there are a lot of these tabs that are similar to the tabs that we saw on Speaker Pelosi's profile, where you can see a break of the industries and PACs, but we're going to look at geography real quick. All right, now that the graph is loaded, you should be able to hear me. So we can see a breakdown here, state, out of state, an idea of, if you weren't paying attention, just how nationalized this race was. You can see that he only got 7% of his funds from in-state. She only got 11% of funds from in-state. The majority of both of their funds were coming from outside of the state. And in those top tier Senate races, that is becoming more and more and more common. But in those lesser known races, the lesser nationalized races, the House races, this is something real indicator of who is tapped in with the voters there, or at least the donors. And with that, unless there are any immediate questions about this, I will hand this over to Sarah and she can talk about outside spending.
Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. And again, you can feel free to drop some chats. So I'm going to try to share my screen. And if I have any breaking up or anything, let me know. I can definitely riff without the screen. No worries there if that happens. So before I launch into all of this, Brendan showed Nancy Pelosi's page where it showed that she had raised $27 million. And that was, you know, as you saw on that chart, significantly more than a typical member raises. Now, the entire 2020 election cost $14 billion. So if you have Nancy Pelosi raising 27 million, and that's a lot, where's the rest of the money coming from out of that 14 billion? Because 27 million is a lot of money, but it certainly doesn't begin to make that big of a dent in a $14 billion federal election cycle. What comes into the fold now is what we call outside spending. And that's kind of a term of art. It refers to spending that's what we might think of as outside of the control of the traditional disclosure and regulatory regime. Most outside spending groups were born of the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United in 2009, or 2010, technically. And that led to the creation of what we call super PACs, which are groups that are allowed to receive unlimited amounts of money from essentially anyone and spend it however they see fit, with the exception that they cannot directly coordinate with a candidate. How that kind of plays out in the real world gets a little funky, because you see things that look a lot like candidate ads on your television, but they're actually technically not linked to the candidate. And that's perfectly legal. So super PACs and outside spending groups have become such a major portion of the overall campaign finance landscape since 2010. And tracking and keeping an eye on that money can oftentimes be really important for understanding who's trying to influence policy and politics, but it can oftentimes be complicated and confusing because, unlike Nancy Pelosi for Congress, you don't necessarily know what Mysterious Super PAC LLC Inc. is. And that's where we can help. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully it won't do anything funky. But and please chat me if I start to break up. But we include all of this information on Open Secrets. Again, federal only. And unlike most of our campaign finance data, this data is very close to real time. That's just due to the way that it's disclosed. These groups have to disclose their spending every day. So in our outside spending section, which you can access from the menu, outside spending, you can see, like what I was talking about, Supreme Court decision, Citizens United was in this cycle. And since then, we've seen an explosion in the amount of money spent by these outside spending organizations, which includes super PACs and other assorted miscellaneous dark money groups like nonprofits, but it's primarily super PACs. We break that out by different type, but I think what's most interesting to most people is, who are these groups that are spending such massive amounts of money? We have information about every group that's registered with the FEC. We classify it by its type. Is it a 501c3? Is it a 527 IRS organized organization? Is it a carry committee, which is a hybrid PAC? These start to get really technical, but can have important implications for disclosure. And then we rank, we order them based on how much money they're spending. If you work in this space for a while, you start to kind of learn what these names are. But I know that to people who don't, it's like, I don't know what Senate Leadership Fund is. These have become and have taken on the role of being the mouthpieces of party leadership. And that I don't think was the intent of the Supreme Court when they decided the case. So of the organizations on this list, of the top 5, I think all 5 of them are linked heavily to the House and Senate leadership. There's a conservative one and a liberal one for each chamber. And these groups function in effect like political parties. Except for they're political parties with very long leashes. And they can receive huge amounts of money from oftentimes very anonymous donors. So you can see Senate Leadership Fund, the biggest in 2020, spent $293 million, entirely opposing Democrats. You can look at the candidates targeted. These names will not be a surprise if you live in America. John Ossoff, Cal Cunningham, Teresa Greenfield, the biggest Senate Democratic candidates were targeted by this group to the order of $92 million in Ossoff's case. So you can get a sense of kind of where they're spending their money, how much they're spending their money. And in the case of a group like this, who is giving the money to the group? You've probably heard the word dark money. And Senate Leadership Fund is organized as a super PAC. By law, it has to disclose its donors to the Federal Election Commission, and we collect that information. But what ends up happening is you end up with them legally disclosing donors like One Nation, which is an organization, a nonprofit. And unfortunately, nonprofits don't have to disclose their donors. So this kind of launders the money. I mean, that's a little harsh, but it makes it so that even though we theoretically know that one nation is making the donation, unless you do extra investigative work, including oftentimes reaching out to nonprofits to collect their tax filings or pretty heavy investigative journalism, we really don't have any sense of who that donor is. So that's one way that the money really can get masked. The rest of the information here is more of the type that we've seen before. This list of organizations, in this case, is much more clearly a list of very wealthy people. So I toggled over to our donors tab. Here you can see the top donors to these outside spending groups. These names may be familiar, may not. Michael Bloomberg, certainly. But you'll see Sheldon Adelson, Michael Bloomberg, Thomas Steyer, Ken Griffin, Richard Uihlein. So these are kind of the heavy hitters of the outside spending universe. And they're people who are able to drop $215 million to these super PACs, which really end up driving a huge portion of the political advertising in elections now. So we have the ability for you to, like Brenna was showing it off earlier, kind of look across time, look at sort of the recipients, and more information like that. So that's kind of the main outside spending section. One second. Okay, so I think that's probably, you can dig into a lot of this elsewhere in our outside spending section. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these other options, single candidate super PACs.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
What were you just looking at? Let's say there's a donor that doesn't want to be identified. He wants to make his donations or whatever to whatever candidate or whatever party that he wants to make a contribution to, but he doesn't want to be identified. Is there any way now that that person can hide his donations as he makes them?
Yes and no. I think that the primary way that would happen would be for the donor to make a donation to a nonprofit, and then for the nonprofit to make a donation to a super PAC of some kind. Now, reporters in this space are typically pretty attuned to large donations coming from unknown sources. I remember in 2012, a huge donation came out of Kentucky to a super PAC, and they had listed an address, which is required by law. And the address was just of an accountant in Kentucky or Tennessee. And this guy was just like inundated with vans from national press organizations trying to figure out who he was. So it can be kind of difficult to have public large donations truly go unknown for a long period of time. Furthermore, it's actually technically not allowed, although the FEC, which hasn't even had full occupancy of its membership of late, or up until very recently, the FEC does enforce sort of the transparency components of the law. So if you report a donation from a shell company, for example, you're going to get a request for additional information from the FEC saying, hey, I see the shell company on your disclosure form. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? That's not true disclosure. But it won't be until oftentimes well after the election that whole matter is wrapped up. If I was a really rich person and I wanted to do political spending and not be seen, I would go a totally different route. And I would spend a bunch of money on Facebook advertisements and skirt the disclosure requirements altogether. And to do that, I would be running advertisements that didn't use any language about voting for or against and fell outside of a certain window around an election. So, and that is 30 days for a primary or 60 days for a general. This is getting very legal and very technical very quickly, but if you are running an advertisement and it mentions a candidate and you're doing it the day before the election, that counts as a political ad to the Federal Election Commission, and you have to disclose information about how you're paying for that, regardless of what the content of the ad is. If it's before that 60-day window, you don't have to disclose information unless you use that vote for or against language. So, a lot of times you'll see a lot of spending by organizations and then it completely falls off right before that disclosure window. So there are ways that groups can go around disclosure requirements, but typically I'd say that it can be pretty challenging to truly mask the source of the money through a combination of what is required and diligent reporters who are making sure that nothing gets by them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Now that I'm kind of back on mental track, and thank you for getting me there, I want to pull over to one of our new tools. And I mentioned Facebook, so I will do that. So if you go to our political ad section, also under the menu, this section is not currently being updated for a variety of reasons, but in its heyday, we tracked $2.1 billion in advertisements spent on Facebook and Google in 2021 or in 2020. And that's just a massive, there's a lot of money, massive amount of money. And this data resource, which Facebook voluntarily put out into the world, and by I'll put voluntarily in quotes because they were going to be voluntold if they did not volunteer. And so they created a public resource. It's very difficult to use. It's very messy. It's not particularly well overseen, but it does exist. And through this, you can see a list of every advertiser, how much they spent, and where they spent it. It's really a phenomenal data trove, and I think a lot of people don't know about it. So we've compiled this information onto Open Secrets, and we also share it with a couple separate partners to do additional work. But you can see here who the top advertisers are, how much they spent on Facebook, and if you are to click on one of them, this is my favorite. I love this section. I work on it really closely, and I just think it's so cool. Trump Make America Great Again Committee. How we love to forget, but this group was very active in 2020, spending $140 million. And what the Open Secrets, we're the only group that does this that I know of. We actually compile the assorted Facebook pages that Make America Great Again ran. Now, most political groups run multiple Facebook pages. So you'll see, relevant to this organization, Black Voices for Trump, for example, brought to you by the Trump campaign. So they spent $993,000, which is a lot for Facebook ads. So you can see all of the Trump Make America Great Again affiliated Facebook pages, how much they spent, and in a particular stroke of coolness, we also allow you to link directly to the Facebook page for this group. This Facebook library, which is actually a Facebook tool, you need to have a Facebook profile to access it, will let you see all of the advertisements run by that particular Facebook entity, as well as how much they cost and where they were targeted. So Facebook banned political advertisements late in 2020, but you can see what they looked like prior to that. A lot of, obviously anti-Biden stuff, some advertisements for like hats and whatever. So it's super cool just how much you can get into that through their tool. Now, their search function is awful. So if I type, for example, Biden, well, now it's gotten better, but it used to not show President Joe Biden. It would be like Biden, Kentucky or something. It looks like they've improved it, but it will, hopefully show you some of what you need. But our sorry, our page has a search tool as well. If I can navigate back to it, sorry. Which will allow you to search for, let's say I was looking for immigration. There's all of the immigration groups, or guns. You know, those are just groups that have that word in their name. But it can really be helpful for identifying if you're seeing a Facebook ad and it's coming up over and over again, and it's spent by, you know, they're spending a lot of money, but you don't know who they are. This can kind of be helpful for getting you information. What's cool about the Facebook pages themselves is Facebook requires the advertiser to disclose a certain amount of information through their page transparency option, which will let you see how many times the page has changed its name, what else they used to merge with a zip code and city that they're based in, which can be really useful information. It says people who manage this page, that it doesn't actually show you who they are, but it shows you where they live. I loved when I found all the Trump pages from Russia. Organizations that manage this page, all of that kind of information can be really, really helpful for tracking down sort of where money's coming from. And this is for any level of election.
Sarah, had a quick question, because I was literally thinking about that as you talking and pointing to some of those pages. Is it clear, or is there a way to identify and track whether that sort of money, that channel of money, does have domestic origin, or whether or not it may have a domestic origin, but it somehow flows through another channel that may be abroad?
Yeah. No. And that is a huge, huge problem. One good example, the National Rifle Association is a huge political actor, less so now, but they were a huge political actor even so far as, you know, a year ago. And their nonprofit arm, this starts to get really tricky with a lot of these groups, because they have the nonprofit, they have the PAC, they have the super PAC, they have the party wing, so they have different elements of themselves, which oftentimes will transfer money to different branches. But the NRA's nonprofit branch, very somehow somebody identified that the NRA received a large contribution from another country, from someone in another country. I don't remember the details. I can send a link after this to when I remember the story. But that went into the NRA's nonprofit sort of being. Nonprofits are allowed to spend money directly on politics, but they are doing so under sort of goodwill. And the IRS theoretically knows that a political group is not supposed to spend foreign money on domestic politics, but the IRS is very, very nervous to do anything related to enforcement of that kind of political law. And so we really have very little sense of whether sort of foreign money is reaching domestic campaigns. But that's how it happens, is through nonprofits who are allowed to spend money on politics. They're also allowed to receive money from foreign governments. They're not allowed to spend the foreign government or foreign agency or foreign people or foreign anyone. They're not allowed to spend that money on domestic policy, but they, you know, no one's watching that.
They're supposed to silo their money, but who knows if that really happens?
Exactly. I mean, their accountants do, and theoretically the IRS does, if we trust the IRS. But I don't.
You made the important point, the interesting point about whether there's a political will to go down that route and call attention to that when that organization, that agency doesn't want to be perceived as putting their thumbs on the scales, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah, because when I looked at that site, and anytime I see a word like organization and it has an S in it, it makes me kind of like raise my eyebrow a little bit. So
Yeah, we have a out of date but helpful section on dark money, which describes how this kind of quote unquote laundering process works. When we do the lobbying presentation later this month, I will talk to Corey and to Anna, who I think is going to be involved in that. She's the best in the business at tracking money through IRS forms. And I might be able to convince her to do 15 minutes on that process, if that's of interest to you guys. But it's complicated because IRS data is non-existent. Now, the IRS is a great organization at taking money from taxpayers. They are not a great organization at being a political disclosure agency. And so the disclosure is fine, but they don't disclose anything to the public. So the IRS knows who's giving money to these nonprofits, but the public doesn't. And the only way we can really learn about that is by looking at donations from nonprofits to other nonprofits, because they do have to disclose to whom they give money. So if you have a nonprofit who's giving money to another nonprofit, that's one way to get at it. But they don't have to disclose where they got the money from. So it ends up being a lot of weird matching, and it's very unclear oftentimes how the money flows. Anna is great at seeing this kind of information, the recipient, sort of who the independent contractors are, who's running their media services, for example. These groups are shared by political agencies. So Main Street Media is a Virginia-based entity that does media buys for many conservative organizations. So you can see that Crossroads shares it with the Republican National Committee and with other sort of groups like that to kind of start to draw that web.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And full disclosure, just so I can be transparent, I mean, in my day job, separate from this, I actually work for that agency, but it's got nothing to do with any of this. I work in something that's totally different. So that's.
I mean, they're a great agency and we love them.
It's all good. It's all good.
I will not cast aspersions on the IRS. I should know better with a Washington-based audience.
Feel free.
Usually it's just because no one wants, taxes. But my mom used to work for the IRS, so I've been there. Anyway, so that is most of what I wanted to kind of show off. I'm going to stop sharing, but I'm happy to share if I need to. And I'd love to take any more questions, comments, sort of like, what do we do next? There's a lot of data, a lot of tools on Open Secrets. I think oftentimes the best way to get what you need is to just email us and we can help you out. But there's a lot to digest.
Yeah, what we just did tonight is just a very high look down overview of all the different types of data we can offer you. And we are more than happy when you email press. It's going to go to Sarah and I, and we can either, one of us helps you or one of our experts can help you.
Been great.
I had a quick question. It's about the raw data. I know that you guys upload data, takes a few days to get it on your site. And a lot of times, that breaking story we're writing about quarterly, that quarterly report comes out. And I have it set up where I get a lot of the reports straight to my inbox. So that's good. But when I try to go back and just find that quarterly report, I can never find it on my own if I don't find the email. Because when you go to their page on the FEC website, it's now combined for the whole 2-year.
Right, yeah.
You know what I mean?
I know what you mean. Is
there a way to find the quarterly report on the website directly, or is it only if you get it by email?
Yeah, okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And this is like a little FEC walkthrough. Now I use the FEC, they just redid everything. And it's way better. We'll dig up who, we'll see. So if you go to, it'll have the Nancy Pelosi candidate page. You always want to go to the committee page. And what I would look at would be the filings, filings page. And then you can toggle back in time. Now, big campaigns are going to have a lot of these kind of RFAIs, requests for additional information or amendments. But if you click on any of these, like the pre-general report, you should be able to see the information from the cycle to date as it was in the pre-general report for Pelosi, for example. What we do is a little bit different. We actually collect, and I can kind of probably off this conversation, I could walk through a little bit of how we do this. We collect what we call the summary data, which is a list of all the reports filed, and we archive that every month through the election period. So I can go back and say, like what's Pelosi's April 2019 fundraising, and that how does that compare to April 2021, for example, because I have that information archived. But if you didn't have that, that's how I would get to it, would be through the filings tab on the FEC's Nancy Pelosi for Congress page. You always want to I think this is where a lot of people get hung up, actually, sounds like you have a pretty good background in this, but is they, you search for the candidate and then there's like nothing on this page, filings, statement of candidacy, a million times. So you need to make sure you're always on the right congressional committee page. Does that answer your question?
Thank you so much.
No problem. And you can do this. The FEC is so the breaking story stuff, I'm constantly fighting with our reporter about this because I'm like, I can't do it any faster. When the reports come in, they come in. So there is definitely like this breaking news aspect of campaign filings that our system is not set up well to deal with, but that you can set up alerts with the FEC to get those reports. Now, what we can do that I think is useful is for example, the presidential race. I'm going to navigate kind of quickly over here since we're short on time. You can see like all of the information aggregated, all of the contributors aggregated to all of Biden's campaign committees and his outside groups and all of the things supporting and opposing him. So we are able to kind of compile it and deduplicate it in a way, I'd say probably faster than anyone else, but there's some hubris there, I'm sure. And so, but for like, if you want to know who the top contributors are on like filing day, you have to go to the FEC because we wouldn't have that. Okay, I'll stop sharing again. Okay. Who do you cover? What region? What area?
I work for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, So the entire Georgia delegation, every reporting period, we, of course, focusing on the senators, Warnock, Ossoff, and that stuff, but we kind of look at everyone.
Awesome. Yeah, busy times.
Yes, and I appreciate Open Secret. I've used you guys, particularly when I was writing about earmarks, back in the day when earmarks were a thing, you guys really had some good historic information about that. That was useful. And I guess my question is, are you guys going to bring that back now that earmarks are coming back?
I hope so. But as of right now, what I know about that is that they're disclosed by the members. And so until we come up with a system for pulling that information from every member page, which we could, it's going to be a minute before we can get that all linked up. The other thing about that is that the earmark data that they're providing now is just nonprofits and local governments, as I'm sure you know, and that is less probably relevant to our mission, just due to the nature of what local governments are lobbying for. But of course, there's always opportunities for corruption everywhere. So I think I'd love to get it and I say that so flippantly, but I live in Chicago, so I'm allowed to. And I'm hopeful that we should be able to grab it sometime. I'm sure that if we don't solve that problem, the technical problem, someone else will. And we can hopefully work with that person to collect that information. Other questions?
Well, if you think of a question later, we are available. Corey has my direct email, and press@crp.org. We will respond to with anything that you have a question about.
And I just dropped my email in the chat. And then also somebody had mentioned state and local data. The best person to contact for that is Pete Quist at followthemoney.org, and his email is right there. And I know him well, and he would be happy to help you. They, I know, are paying really close attention to the Virginia gubernatorial race this year. And so we'll probably be covering a lot of data for you guys. Oh, and one more question. I love this question. What stories do you think don't get told enough that can be done with your data? All of them. There's so much we can do with our data. You know, I love, my area right now is race and gender data. And my approach to that has always been, I give presentations all the time. I used to focus on gender. And people were like, what about race? And I'm like, well, we don't have any data on that, which is true. Because unlike with a name, you can't like look at, you know, Tia Mitchell and say, you are, you know, X racial category. And actually, you can't even look at a person, a photo of a person, and say that with any degree of accuracy, especially if you're a white person like I am. And so we went through a foundation to get funding to identify, to contact every federal candidate and ask them for their racial identification. And so now we have that for all of Congress. And I think that these stories, and just I'm working on kind of our summary report for that right now. And every data point I dig into inspires another story. So I was looking at like Cori Bush and Marie Newman, two candidates, very similar regions, St. Louis and Chicago. Bush got way less money than Marie Newman did, even though they have almost identical policy positions. And the biggest donor to Marie Newman was Emily's List. So I'm like, okay, what's the deal with Emily's List? Why are they not supporting this viable Black candidate in St. Louis? And so then that led me down the like conduit committees and how they support different types of candidates in different parts of the country and who sort of gets a seat at the table conversation. So I think that most people talk about money in politics as though it's kind of like one thing, but money isn't the same thing in every place, and money doesn't have the same meaning in every place. And so for Bush to raise $900,000, for example, in St. Louis and take down an incumbent, there's a much different story there than for Pelosi to raise $27 million. So I think that I like that element, which I think is coming up more and more, the demographic and the identity component. I hope that people use this gigantic racial identification database for all sorts of stories like that. So that's my kind of bugaboo. Brendan, do you have another answer to that question?
I would say one thing, we kind of already touched on this, but one thing that kind of pops up to reporters when I'm speaking to them is our geography data. It's something that is available on the FEC, but might not be as readable anywhere else than our site. And as Sarah said earlier, being able to pinpoint where someone is getting their money from, especially now that we have access to, through Act Blue and Win Red, all of those small donors and where they're coming from. If you're getting a lot of $15, $20 contributions from within your district, that's a big tell that you have a lot of support from those donors within your district. But if a lot of it is coming from the other side of the country or from big fundraisers in the Washington, D.C. area, that might not be as successful. That might not be as successful of a candidate. And also I would look at expenditures data. A lot of times you can see people that share vendors, like we were saying, people that were sharing advertisers. You can tell a lot of who is working together and where there's overlap by where people are spending their money, especially if they're spending in similar places and with similar vendors.
Can I ask a question? by looking at the political committees, like Democratic National Committee and Republican National Committee, do they do anything in terms of, I thought they're supposed to help candidates in terms of, receiving funds and help them with their funding and what have you like that. Can you get any of this information out of the committees that is going to show you how are they supporting candidates?
Good question. Yes and no. So parties can make donations to candidates, but the amount that they can give is limited. So it's not like you can give $1 million to a candidate. But increasingly, the party committees spend money much the same way that super PACs do. And I'm going to share my screen again. I'm just so into sharing my screen. This is our page for the DNC. So you can see here that the DNC, which is the sort of presidential focused party committee, spent $18 million in coordination. They're allowed to do that, to coordinate with Joe Biden in 2020. So that gives you one sense. I'll go to a better one, a more interesting one, DCCC. So here you can see, and I know I toggle so quickly, but if you Google or if you use our search tool to find Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, you'd get to the overview page, and it's just the expenditures tab that you're looking for. So you can see the candidates that the DCCC targeted in 2020. And in this case, as is often the case with party committees, nearly all of those expenditures are negative. So they're kind of that's becoming more and more common for the candidates to run the positive ads and leave the negative advertising to the parties and super PACs. But you can see how much money they spent opposing a lot of the Republican candidates. I think almost all of these ones won. The DCCC had a bad year. But I think that can oftentimes be really interesting information for sort of who the DCCC thinks is vulnerable. And all the party committees do this, so you can find it for any of the big ones.
And the super PACs connected with leadership that we were looking at.
Yes, they kind of are the new party committees in some ways. And the reason they are the new party committees is because unlike the NRSC, which can receive, $10,000 from a donor, the Senate Leadership Fund can receive $1 million from a single donor. So why would you go after, $100,000, $10,000 donors when you could wrap it all up with one Sheldon Adelson? So who has recently passed. Not him anymore, but there's sort of an active group of major millionaire donors contributing so much money to the sort of party apparatus.
One area of our site that's kind of related to that is also our joint fundraising committee section, where we were just speaking about coordination. I'm not going to lose the audio by jumping because my internet is not as stable as Sarah's. But we do have a full joint fundraising committee section that allows you to track instances where members of Congress or candidates would be forming a joint fundraising committee with each other or a party committee or some or the other sort of organization.
And anything else from anyone? These are really great questions. I have one. I have thrown it in the chat, so I'll just throw it out there. Do either of you really use data viz tools like Tableau, stuff like that, and the way you tell your stories or frame your stories?
Our journalists do. Okay. They have some really good flourish charts in the stories that we publish. My background's in academia, so if I can make it with a Google sheet and a table and a bar chart, that tends to be what I do. I'm not an expert in that, but Carl Evers-Hillstrom, our reporter, is very good with his visualizations, and I think that can oftentimes be so much more impactful than a long text about how X group gave money to Y group to Z group back to Y group. So it can be really great. I think Robert, with some of our dark money graphics, which weren't built in Tableau or Flourish actually, are really good at showing kind of some of these dark money networks. So we do leverage visualizations. I just don't
personally, because I don't know how.
There you go. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Well, it looks like there are no more questions. So I'm Tia. I'm chair of NABJ's Political Task Force, which co-hosted the event today with the Washington Association of Black Journalists. We want to thank you guys both for, joining us and sharing your expertise. And I encourage participants, make sure you copy and paste those email addresses from the chat, both for Open Secrets, the Center for Responsive Politics, as well as for followthemoney.org. And we just want to thank you guys for doing this for us. And again, thank you for everyone who participated, because you all asked great questions and were really engaged. And you know where to catch me in the Political Task Force if you need me. And of course, Corey, again, from WABJ. So if there are no more questions, we're going to wish everyone have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Brendan. And
It was
thank
really
you
nice to be
for
here.
joining.
Corey,
Thank
we'll
you.
be in touch.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation.
Bye-bye. Have a nice evening.
Okay, take care. Bye.